Thank you, Jeremy. I have about 3,000 questions I've just written down, so I can't wait to get to the question part. James, would you like to talk about the piece with OccupyFaith?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'm with OccupyFaith DC. Well, I'd like to thank Art Matters and Lauren for inviting OccupyFaith DC to have a voice in this very nice event. So, just a little bit of background on me personally. I came to Washington, D.C. as an organizer for the Network of Spiritual Progressives. We have a chapter here in the D.C. area. For some of you, you may recognize Tikkun magazine. I don't know if that rings a bell, but I'm affiliated with that group. The way that we got involved with the Occupy movement was the Network of Spiritual Progressives nationally had endorsed Freedom Plaza, October 2011, Stop the Machine movement, which is not really at its base. It was not an Occupy movement out of New York. It was different, and it set up at Freedom Plaza. And I remember we had a chapter meeting of the Network of Spiritual Progressives, and we said, yeah, we think this is a nice event. We support it. We're in solidarity with it. And I told the group, I said, we'll get more involved in the future. But little did I know that our initial involvement would grow significantly. And through that, we called a meeting on October 26, 2011. And that's how OccupyFaith got started. Now, I was characterized as a founder, but in reality, everyone who came to that particular set of early meetings, October and through November, you know, we worked together to create this coalition. And what drove me to really call the initial meeting was this notion of, you know, I just looked at the demographics of the greater DC area, and I said, you know, there are probably, you know, at least, I don't know, 400,000 to 600,000 people of faith in this greater region, you know, which is made up of about 7 to 8 million. I mean, who are at least sympathetic to the Occupy movement. Most not involved, but at least sympathetic. And I said, you know, we need to get together under an interfaith framework so that we could include the greatest number of people of faith to support the Occupy movement directly. And I saw this as a moment in history that we could not afford to pass up or passively observe. But it was our responsibility to come out on the side of social justice. And we know from our religious traditions, and Jeremy did a good job of describing some of them, that we're compelled by our faiths to stand on the side of the dispossessed, the marginalized, and those who are suffering. And the Occupy movement represented that opportunity. And so what we did was we got together and we said, we'll try to support the Occupy movement in the following ways. We'll try to provide material support like food and some supplies and some money for things to keep the encampment vibrant and healthy. The other thing that we looked at doing, which OccupyFaith was already, the Occupy Church was already doing, was to reinforce the idea of spiritual support and the need for spiritual support. So there were several events that we held and co-sponsored with faith organizations, including Occupy Judaism. Another thing that we felt was important was to promote the ideals of the Occupy movement in faith-based communities throughout the region. So the way we have done that and the way we started off doing that was to go to different places of worship and different events and talk about Occupy from a faith perspective. And these are the type of things that we felt would garner more and more support for the Occupy movement. There's always been a question, are we part of Occupy or are we just a support mechanism? Well, the truth of the matter is that we've never resolved that. It's always been a healthy tension, and I think we prefer it that way. Because what it has allowed us to do is sort of take a hybrid approach where people of faith who are interested in Occupy can link in with us and work with other people of faith, or they can go directly, to the Occupy movement. Early on, it was the encampments, of course, and get directly involved. So this allowed us the freedom to tailor our approach, to customize it specifically to an interfaith audience. And so far, it's worked pretty well. I'll just talk quickly about several of the highlights. The first major project that we took on was we held a Thanksgiving meal for both encampments, and we turned that around. It was a big endeavor, but we turned it around pretty quick, some of those things, and the key being outreach. And so we've taken every opportunity that we can to talk to people of faith in a wide variety of forms. As a matter of fact, I just came from a conference that was put on by Occupy DC today, the Money Out of Politics conference that was held at All Souls. And we did a breakout discussion on faith and Occupy there. So, we continually look for opportunities to talk about the coalition and the need for people of faith to engage in this conversation. We have also done some preliminary work with Occupy Our Homes, and there's more of that to come. We are planning an economic inequality weekend, and we've moved the date back to the first weekend in June, where we hope to get about 20 different faith communities and congregations to talk about economic inequality on that weekend during their worship times. This is one of our major outreach efforts for the spring, and we hope to build a critical mass here in the greater capital region so that people of faith have a viable, strong voice in this conversation about Occupy and about economic inequality and access to our political system.
Thank you. Again, the questions grow. I just have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you guys about, and then please feel free to join in with questions as let's get to the really casual piece. So you've both spoken about a little bit about what's happening now. I think what I'm interested in learning more about that I think you've touched on is some of the people in this room are already engaged, some aren't. How do each of you see the Occupy movements that you're involved in, the pieces you're involved in? How do you see them growing, and what kind of strategies? Like, where do you see yourselves and the organizations in a year, 2 years, 5 years, in terms of, are you organizing as nonprofits, 501c3s? Are you staying away from that kind of structure? Are you getting involved in that? Are you building websites as the way to communicate? Are you doing more face-to-face? Once that central location was gone, sort of, how are you? And you spoke a little bit, James, about that you're out speaking at events and things like this, like today. What kind of organizations are being developed to progress the ideas and the ideals and the strategies? So either and both. Sort of like, how can they help too? How can they get involved? How can we get involved? And Why would we and what would we do?
I think that the call to an ordinary person from the Occupy movement is still to go down to the Occupy encampment during a General Assembly, get involved, and or inquire as to what different working groups you'd like to be affiliated with. And right now, the working groups that we have are corporate personhood. So there's a group working towards the abolition of corporate personhood. There's the criminal injustice, which is working on the criminal and the prison industrial complex and racism in the prison industrial complex. There is Occupy Our Homes, which is working on foreclosure resistance and helping folks to resist foreclosure. There's OccupyFaith is another group to be involved in, and OccupyFaith has a mission to the synagogues and churches surrounding mosques to sort of do outreach from the Occupy movement to there. And of course OccupyChurch, and we meet on Saturdays at 10:30 currently at my house. In terms of a 5-year plan, so that's the thing. If you go to the Occupy encampment during one of the General Assemblies, you know when those are? You know when those are? When are the GAs? When are the GAs at Occupy? Do you know? When are they taking place?
The joint ones are still at 6, I think. But it's on
Tuesday, okay. So that's one thing to do. For me personally, like in terms of a 5-year plan, I think that it involves they're like people of faith that have come together through these connections. And my job at the Quixote Center, which I'm a full-time employee at the Quixote Center, so my job is to fundraise. So your donations are very much appreciated.
And the website address is?
Quixote.org. You can go to Quixote.org and make a contribution there. But my job is to nurture these communities like Occupy Church, like Occupy Faith, in other places, and to create a workshop curriculum that can spread grassroots democracy, as well as create a portal, a web portal, which I was a web developer before I was doing all this. I quit my job as a web developer. Well, I sort of segued into it as a consultant. then I got this job, so then I quit my job as a web developer. That's what I did. But so I'm going to build a fancy website that will allow people to have like organizational chapters, and then they can collaborate about ideas, and we can do theology that's sort of, that resists the power of money together, and we can build social networks so we can reinforce one another and be a community on the web. But the community on the web and successful online communities push people to get together face to face. So the real community that I'm looking to do is a community that both does spiritual discernment and grassroots activism. And in anything there's a spiritual component, like for us as Christians, a worship or a discernment process, and then a decision making component. So that's the model, and we're working to operationalize it and figure out how to. And I'm making connections in like New York, Boston, Harrisonburg, Chicago. I was in Oakland. Just talking to people all across to see what they need, how I can help them, how we can network together, and starting like a conference call and these things. So yeah.
Is you at the Oakland meeting, aren't they coming up with some things as well?
So there's also the Protest Chaplains is the organization. It's an interfaith group that is they call themselves Occupy Faith. So it's like Occupy Faith National, AKA Protest Chaplains. People that were doing what we are doing with the tents, ministering to people at the encampments, and they are right now they're planning a truth commission called the gathering information around foreclosures. So like interviewing people just like ordinary people in foreclosure, and saying how do you lose your home, how this happened, what's going on, documenting like cases of injustice, and then they're going to take all that and sift through it and create like a report, basically, to create a new narrative of what's happening. And they're going to be doing this to spread awareness. They're going to be doing a bus tour to collect this Truth Commission testimony, but it's going to start a grassroots process that's going to last for a significant period of time and culminate in a rally here in Washington, D.C. in the next year.
So one of my, I guess, sort of assumptions about Occupy Church was that there was a motivation to change the church.
Oh yeah.
And so I think I would love to hear more about what does that look like for you guys? Like one of the things I'm hearing a lot about is the economic piece. You mentioned the social justice and nonviolence piece, of course, talking about the scriptures that you guys would read and things. So how are you guys thinking about occupying the church, the different church structures specifically, and what are the issues that are important? I mean, I come from a very recent, very intense experience with my own faith, and have sort of inadvertently occupied my church. Yeah. So thank you very much. So my question is, you know, one of the things I was accused of was setting up a protest action, like, oh great, my mom's dead, let me go do this terrible action and cause a big thing. So, not that I would suggest anyone do that at anyone's funeral, but, you know, one of the things that I think has been so powerful in the Occupy movement overall is going to the place and being present as the people in juxtaposition to the place. And so, you know, one of the things I've learned a great deal about Catholic politics. Not that I know anything compared to some of the people in this room, but I've learned a great deal in the last couple of months. And so it seems like I get very excited at the idea of an Occupy Church movement that is really, in a loving way, holding up a mirror to the structure and the hierarchy, the patriarchy, and saying, this is what we see, this is who we are, look at how different we are, and how do we dialogue to make real, meaningful change. And so I'd like to hear more about what you guys think about that and what you're doing in those terms, either or both of you.
Okay, well, I'll just back up a moment to answer the first question, and then I'll go directly into the question you just asked. You know, Occupy Faith DC, what we've been talking about this transition since the encampments have been shut down. Well, they're sites now. I don't really call them encampments so much anymore, but since the raids, there's been a lot of questions in terms of what our mission was, because, you know, we pretty much positioned ourselves as supporters initially of what was going on at the encampments, and then to some extent, but more indirectly, efforts that were taking place outside. But now we are transitioning to sort of becoming more of a herald about the need for people of faith to speak out in general to the society on efforts of reform and to challenge the status quo. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. You know, in terms of how we plan on sustaining ourselves, well, this is quite a discussion that we're having among ourselves, because there have been folks who said, well, we need to generate income and sustain ourselves and build more of a structure. It's on the table, but it hasn't finally been decided which way we're going to do, which direction we're going to go in that effort. But it definitely is a serious consideration, because you have people who dedicate a significant amount of their time and effort to making sure that Occupy Faith DC continues to operate. And so how we support them, but how we also make sure that the structure is robust enough to continue this effort is on the top of our agenda. So we're really in a transition phase. In terms of how we want to approach the overall society, I think this is really a critical issue, because, you know, at least a lot of us feel that humanity is in the midst of a spiritual awakening, and it shows up in all of the faith traditions. And one of the interesting things about Washington, D.C., along with other places, is that there's a very strong tradition of interfaith dialogue here. And I think that is a competitive, well, that's an economic term. It's an advantage to have that tradition, but we want to ramp it up. And what we try to live out on a daily basis, at least with Occupy Faith DC, is this belief that you don't have to be of the same faith in order to work together based on principles and based on a common vision for the betterment of humanity. And we've been able to do it. What's interesting is when we start as a coalition to navel gaze and to really pin down some of the ideals, it becomes more of a messy process. When we focus on the larger vision of reinforcing what Occupy has set as a standard, engaging around economic inequality, engaging people in terms of what your faith or what their faith says about these issues, it is easy for us to cooperate and collaborate with each other. And it's on that larger principle of cooperation that we feel we have our greatest strength.
So for us at the Occupy Church, we believe that collective decision-making, when it's done in a community of faith, like when it is rooted in a spiritual practice, when we're listening for what we understand to be the Holy Spirit or the Spirit generally, or as some people call it, like when we're in a secular context, we talk about listening for truth. That can be transformational in and of itself, and that the act of coming together in a group, the act of being together and like making decisions together is spiritually transformational. And I think that our churches are finding out through time that the lecture format of church is not transformational. And so the idea is that you're trying to basically cause something else to happen when you're talking to somebody. With the amount of information that's going around nowadays, people aren't as transformed by careful lectures. They're just not as, it just doesn't work. I think that for the modern person that doesn't work as well. You have to do the thing you want to cause together. And so that's why I think that the movement the idea is to help inflame the body politic of the church to their mission to make decisions together and to catch a collective local vision for economic democracy and then for them to enact that themselves. And so in order to do that, that's a process by which we would take a church, and so there's we want to create these small groups like Occupy Church to do this. And then train and find these people that are already in these groups that are already doing these things and help give them the training they need to be able to approach their churches to create these processes so that their churches can do grassroots democracy and be transformed through a revival of social justice.
So a catalyst and then the support for the growth.
Yeah.
That's great.